Okay, so we got an hour to talk about VR Script, what led us here, where I think it's going, and all that. So if I can get all right, there's my phone up here. A lot of latency in that loop. So the VR Script APK right now, it starts up, and it's an interpreter from script files. And the really simple, this is kind of the home screen for some of the example code that I've written to just kind of point out a couple of the things that we've got, where this is a picture taken with a theta with just a few text fields put up on top of it. The initial application that I used as one of the straightforward simple things that people would want to do is basically just linking together multiple photos with voice and text annotations. So there's things like, okay, let's put an audio cue. You should have audio coming from this. Okay. So just being able to play, play audio there, do some basic kind of pop-up things, and then maneuver between multiple panoramas. So just like a few shots inside our office. And this is just a really simple thing that I would imagine a consumer possibly doing, where you take pictures with, with the 360 device, and then you want to be able to string them together. Because the weakness that we've got right now is you can sideload content. You can kind of throw it into the 360 Photos directory and use our existing viewer for it. But all that does is throw them into one unsorted directory, and you page through them. It's not a really great user experience. The other things that were always coming up for me when I talked about the media usage is we support fully panoramic videos, but there's a whole lot of other media systems or media formats like cylindrical panoramas, partial panoramas, things that are just wide-angle cameras. And we have no really good way to use those in Oculus. They're in any of our platforms. Our options are you can write a custom viewer for something where we've got a template program or a template project in the SDK that you can instantiate, give it a name, it creates this whole project, but it's a whole directory full of stuff. And it's not too bad to work with there, but you have to import it into your workspace and start working with it. It's just not a friction-free environment. And it still takes 30 seconds or so to iterate for each cycle when you're trying to download things to the phone. So some of the other tasks that I really wanted to resolve was this ability to make media formats so that somebody could have a new camera or something that would then be able to take whatever field of view, undistort it, generate the right mesh, and show it in virtual reality. And right now that's a process of either making a native project or building a Unity project. And something that I saw last year at one of the conferences, we had a whole bunch of media people talking about their work, and it's almost a funny thing about all these content people learning Unity to be able to do these basic media things. We would have the Felix and Paul systems where they're using Unity to draw a panorama and a prop model. It's basically to draw one single model sometimes to cover up the camera spot, to do a few other things. It'd be nice to be able to fade programmatically. All of these little simple things that game engines are incredibly overkill for, and building fully native projects is a lot more burdensome than it really needs to be. So one of the positions that I was at too in maybe early part of the year, maybe in January, February, was I was thinking about this notion of experience files, where if we define something where you've got a video stream and then a model file, you could do a lot with that, where you could make the model file, the screen it undistorts it properly, it sets it up for that. So that might be some simple declarative form of data, where you bundle this together, probably in a zip file, where you've got an MP4 file with the video stream and then one of our OVR scenes for the model. You could set that up and then play that back, and it would automatically do what you wanted for that particular camera. But it's a slippery slope that you get there, where it's not long before you wind up saying, okay, well, I want some little decision-making process here. I'd like to let people choose one path or the other. And we're starting off with a JSON file. Then we're like, maybe we can put a little bit of logic in here somehow. We can have a basic if statement. And then we need some expression parsing. We want to be able to add some things to that. And it's a very slippery slope to writing a very bad programming language. So I had decided that I didn't want to do something that was really ad hoc like that. At a minimum, I was thinking I could put in kind of the most simple language that was fully featured that I might want to embed sort of inside a JSON file. And I was thinking scheme at that point, like something like one of the tiny schemes or something really, really small and simple, non-performant, but it's at least a real language that people have been writing code in for many, many years. And I had left it at that for a little while working on other projects. And then later when I started working on the social projects, I did some of the basic VR UI for selecting avatars, for selecting rooms to go into, drawing the avatar heads. And this was all in raw C++. And it was fairly miserable. I mean, you just, you got your way through it, but it's not a really pleasant programming experience. There's just all of the problems of working with C++, the wrong abstractions, and some of that's certainly what we have set up as our APIs in C++. But I reached that point where I wanted to do more things for the social. I wanted to make more things. We want board games, we want card games, we want these simple things that do not need game engines fully, but I wanted to be able to develop them fairly quickly and let other people develop them fairly quickly. And that was when I started making down this path of, well, let's consider making a full-fledged interpreted language that we could write VR, not applications so much, but very simple things, more like web page level content, the type of things that were done early on before it blew up to sort of the stage it is today. And because I had been using Racket, which is a scheme Lisp, for some of the social work, I did the servers originally in that, I looked at it and I thought, well, what I really want from a development system is to be able to make this really fast iteration times. I'd like to remote develop onto the phone. So if we can switch over to the PC here. Screen. All right, so this is the Dr. Racket IDE. For real old timers, it kind of feels about like Turbo Pascal or something, which was the good old days, really, in programming in many ways. So to write the kind of simplest possible sort of hello world in what I've got here, this is running on a Mac, and then it talks to, over TCP, to the phone here, running the VR script APK. So the initial thing, part of Racket, is you define what the language that you're using each initial thing in. So it starts off defaulting to Racket, but Racket base is a smaller subset from it. The VR script part of it is in the VR Racket module setup. And then the connection that sets things up initially, we define some kind of a frame function that will initially just do the simplest thing, put up on the HUD. Hello world. And then we talk to it by calling VR main, and I go and I get the IP address of the phone, which is kind of shown on the home screen here. And what the initial thing is going to be. So when I run that, if we can switch back over to the phone, so there it's kind of hello world running on Gear VR as a new program. And that would be, the HUD thing makes it face locked, but there's lots of other text things that you can do to set up. But the idea being there that's that super, super quick one file access. Now, if we want to start putting some other media into it, I've got everything is set up so it's pulling media from the internet and caching it. So if I wanted to replace the simple text to add a background, I can define a reference to a URI. You can use these inline anywhere you want to, but defining them ahead of time lets it be pre-cached. And then I can go ahead and make a model, instantiate that in there, model, and we'll put it at the origin. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, screen back. So there's going to be a lot of screen switching. So back to the phone. It'd be nice if I could have gotten two screens. So here's a model that was loaded in from our OVR scene format, then thrown onto the phone. Now this is something I would love to hear suggestions for a better generic model format. This is something that for years I have not had great closure on, where for texture formats, we've got lots of good, very native hardware-like formats that are easy to load things up. For models, I did another search last year for Oculus starting this up, and we still wound up kind of with our own bundle format. And we have a tool, an offline tool, to convert from FBXs to our OVR scenes. This is how our theaters and our prop models and things are made, but it's not great, and I wish I did have a better solution. But so this is so we're in a model scene that's positioned with the origin kind of right at floor level now, which is not what I want. So go back to the desktop. So instead of putting it at the origin, let's translate. This is OpenGL coordinate system looking down -z, y is up, and x is to the right. So we'll translate it up 2 meters. Oops, wrong way, -2 meters. OK, back to the phone. OK, but that's the type of kind of feedback loop that I wanted so much that is missing terribly from Gear VR development, where there's tons of times when you say, oh, I meant -2, and you recompiled it, and it takes 30 seconds maybe for your native stuff, or if it was in Unity code, it might take a couple minutes to rebuild the project and push it over. So that was my kind of core goal of what I wanted from the development side, is to be at this fast interaction and being able to quickly change things and be able to make it so there's not a whole lot of boilerplate. One of the, I think, early success stories from this is when we were doing a demo at Samsung relatively recently, we had heard that the executive we were demoing to was big into travel and all this, and somebody said, well, let's make a travel application. Let's take a bunch of panoramic photos and add some voiceovers and add some pop-up images and various things. And I set up some basic UI, just here's a button that will pop up a picture, and here's how you swipe to go to the next ones. So I wrote several hundred lines of code there. And then Matt Hooper, our creative director in Dallas, basically went and sourced all the images, put them all in, typed them in, and got it going. And that worked really remarkably well. So the conventional wisdom is that a Lisp can't succeed, that that this type of, it's got parentheses instead of infix notation, prefix and parentheses instead of infix, that's too alien, that that programmers won't deal with this. I mean, you could say that the evidence supports that assertion based on programming language adoption, but my 11-year-old son is programming in Racket, our creative director is programming in Racket. It doesn't seem that ridiculously complicated for me, and there's a lot of interesting things as a programmer. I'd kind of recommend learning a little bit about Lisp. It's got a long and storied history, and there's some valuable lessons to be learned from its time. But on the other hand, we are already working on setting up a system like this so that we can use JavaScript or potentially other languages. So architecturally, what's happening here is the VRScript APK acts sort of like an X server, where it's communicated with only over a TCP pipe. When I'm running it on the desktop, this VR main function actually establishes a connection, talks to it there. It gets an input struct sent over to it, and it writes back a frame struct with everything that's going on. When you're done with developing it, then you can put the script file either on the internet somewhere to be downloaded, or you can put it on the local. You can push it to the like SD card, Oculus VR scripts, and then that home program that lists my few samples, you look over to the right, and anything that you've put in there shows up at that point. So you can write tiny little applications here, and then very quickly kind of put them onto your phone, and then run around with the phone without the PC showing demos there. There are big open questions about exactly how we want to deploy this. The first thing that will be made available to people, hopefully as soon as the next couple weeks, depending on how my schedule goes with some other things, is the ability to use this as kind of an APK development tool, so that you can create something, if you're just doing a simple media application, build it simply like this, and then package it up into an APK for submission to the Oculus Store for going through the conventional path. We are having a lot of discussions internally relating to security and various other aspects of this, but my hope is that we are allowed to do this in more of an open way, where it's more like you can pass a link around and then somebody can click on it in a web page, because that works pretty marvelously, where I register the VRScript scheme on this. So when this APK is installed, any URL in the system that handles it properly, if it sees a VRScript : / and then a net address, it launches VRScript. If you're browsing in the network browser, kind of one of the normal browsers for the phone, you click on one of those links, it says insert into the HMD, you put it in there, and then it runs that script. So let's go back to the PC. So let's get some other things working in here, pull in some other media assets. So the idea was I was going to start something that would be like there's a Kirby's Ninja Dojo on Nintendo that I play with my kids sometimes, throwing stars at a target that inside a scene here. So we've got a few more pieces of media that I can pull into this. Let's get. So we'll take a target. Copy that. Now, one of the other things that I would say about Lisp is I can imagine that editing Lisp in Notepad could be fairly considered user hostile. But if you're in an IDE that does parenthesis matching and auto indentation and all these other things, it's really, really easy. So we'll push this to like -2 on Z. All right, back to the phone. All right, so there's a target. And back to the PC. And then back to the phone. And there's our throwing star. Now let's make some things move. Back to the PC. All right, so let's define a function for the star or to the target position. And there are the harness for this code that's running here is all defined in the VR racket file that kind of wraps the mainframe function. So it basically parses some input that comes from the phone, where you've got touch, joypad. Did I bring the joypad? But you've got all the basic VR information that we have for our native applications, as well as time and gaze, and you get that all pulled out into variables that you can access. So let's set this up to be, we're going to make a vec3. We'll have it move in x just on the sign of script seconds. And we'll leave it at 0, y, -1, z. Again, notice that the parenthesis matching just is very, very easy to do there. And we'll change the star model to be translating oops, wrong one. Again, working in an IDE is nice rather than passing it all to command line. Oops, I'm moving the wrong one. Okay, switch back to the end of the phone. So I was moving the star, wrong star model. What did I do there? Yeah, that actually is one thing. I do intend to put a console in VR. So I get asked that all the time about when do you get to program in virtual reality. And I think that's, in general, a terrible idea. But everybody asks about it, so we will make that happen sooner or later. But at least for getting proper error messages, you want to do it. All right, so there's a moving target. Now the Wi-Fi here is not so great, so it's hitching around on frames. So this is frame synchronous, where it fires one frame of input over the TCP connection, then it gets the frame back. So it does all run with asynchronous time warp, so it's smooth on your head no matter what the frame updates are happening. And in fact, it's a little bit better than the basic, like the way, if it was locked in per frame in the native code, and you moved your head too fast and it didn't get an update, you would have the black pull in. What happens with this, where it is decoupled enough so that it's running the VR frame loop potentially multiple times for each script frame loop. So if you stop updating the script, the animation will be hitchy, but you can look all the way around behind you or whatever. So let's play a sound. Let's get some more of this data from here. So again, these library level functions are in the VR racket, where we've got pressed, all the different actions that you can do on the touchpad with swipes and buttons on the joypad. Okay, so we've got sound there. Okay. So now to actually throw the throwing star, we'll have to define some state. I'll do this parametrically, so I'll set up a start time for when you throw it, and we'll calculate a trajectory just based on the delta from the times. One of the coding conventions in Lisps usually is that global variables, if you choose to use them, you put stars around them, or earmuffs as they're sometimes called. So one aspect about the programming languages in general, where if you had asked me a year or two ago, I was generally pretty down on multi-paradigm languages like Lisp, where I have a high opinion of functional purity, and I started out writing this in sort of a pure functional manner, where especially if you look at some of the Racket tutorials and the realm of Racket, you'll write games in this purely functional manner. And it's you can certainly get that done, but it was awkward enough that something that has an uphill battle for adoption in general, adding an extra level of awkwardness I thought was ill-advised. So I did kind of embrace the global variables for single file scripts. But one of the nice things about Racket specifically is that it's a 20-year-old language development system, and it is extremely powerful in a lot of ways. I'm not really a language advocate. You can do anything in any particular language, so I'm not going to try and say it's the best language for task X, Y, and Z. But it has statically typed options with typed Racket. You can do custom languages to change all sorts of different things. And it's got a wonderful module system. We should only have something so nice in C++ in general. So it's not something that, while I'm setting it up right now, these are all single file scripts. It's not something that if you happen to write 100,000 lines of code in it, you would be up against the limitations of the language. So I think there's some really positive aspects to it. In fact, that's a good time to mention that when I started this out, up until last week, I was using two different scheme implementations. So I was using Racket for the PC side of things, and then I was using a smaller implementation called Chibi Scheme as the embedded part. And my rationale for that was there was only 5,000 something lines of code where I could go in and I could fully audit that and understand it myself if necessary, while Racket is a 20-year-old project with a much larger amount of code in it, and I can't say that I deeply understand any of the inner workings about it. But one of the things that writing documentation focuses you on things that are awkward about it, where there's a number of differences between the minimalistic Chibi scheme, which is a revision 7 basic scheme, You can do anything you need to in that, but Racket is much more of a bells and whistles kind of descendant of that, and there's a lot more that you can get done in there. And I was finding myself over and over doing something in the remote development, and then when I deployed it onto the phone, it no longer worked because something was a little bit different or that particular thing wasn't there. So last week, pretty much while everybody else was practicing their presentations for the keynotes and whatnot, I was swapping out the language infrastructure in VR script. So we're lucky if nothing catastrophically blows up today. But the bottom line is that it's the full Racket running natively on the Android system. And that's also the architecture plumbing that's going to allow us to switch to a JavaScript backend as well. So we've got a start time. We'll have a throw position. And let's define. So the position will be, let's make a start. So we'll start it like 0.2 meters to the right. So unquestionably, Lisp setup like this winds up being a little bit more verbose for things that would be, that you'd use operator overloading in C++ for. So like vector things here, I've got add3 and scale3, and that could be set up as kind of built-in operators. And you could wind up doing, that's one thing about Racket, because you've got full control of the language. You can do anything, even writing infix operations. I choose not to do any of that, because initially I was portable across schemes, and I'm still unsure about the value proposition of radically changing the language definitions directly. So it doesn't bother me too much to have little bits of extra typing that wind up being necessary for this. So we're going to add the star start position and then the direction scaled by the delta in time from when we started it. So when you have the pressed action, we are going to set these variables. And as always, useful when you're working on something new, having a bunch of the samples open in other tabs there. I'm going to go look up what I have for the view position. So the pose, the head tracked pose, is passed in as one of the input parameters, and it automatically builds an inverse because that's commonly used. And then we'll also need to know when it's actually hit something so that it can stop moving. Oh, and you have a debugger works in here. It's not the greatest debugger, but you can step through, but you do have Good old printf. Oh, Wi-Fi is very bad here. Now, I have a fallback position where you can use ADB to talk to it if Wi-Fi is really not working well. So one of the nice things about using this is it actually doesn't require the Android development tools to be installed. So you don't have to go through the whole mess of doing all that. So you can just have an APK installed and then using your desktop PC. It's convenient sometimes to have it so you can look at logcat, or you can use ADB pushes and things like that. What is this? And it stops for a long time. All right, so let's calculate our star pos and use that now for the drawing. Okay, so the star is sideways, so we're going to rotate that now. So we'll do a compose of one of the kind of interesting things about Lisps in general is the identifier syntax is much broader than most languages, where here in this case, pi over 2 is an actual identifier and a constant rather than an expression. That's one of the little side benefits you get from the more uniform syntax. Okay, so here's our throwing star. So now we need to do some hit detection. So when we hit the target, we want to stick in the target, so we'll define an offset. And then we'll define a we'll do it when play our sound there. That should have been throw sound. I'm going to switch over to ADB here. Let's see if this still works. So an ADB forward, and then use, oh, I'm not, well, it should be plugged in. Okay, there we go. Back to the phone. So now going over ADB. But now back to the code. I have an error. So this is why dynamic languages are, in many cases, inferior to statically typed languages. And again. So in general, I am very much more fond of the dynamically typed languages. Wanted. Okay, so in this, I can't tell if it's here or not. Let's make things go much faster. All right, let's change the speed. So the star position, let's scale the star dir here. Okay, that's better. Okay, nice. Yay. Okay. Okay. So, well, it turns out it looks like this live programming is kind of boring, so everybody being quiet while I'm going through this. But this shows basically what I wanted to demonstrate about the quick iteration cycles and the straightforward ability to use this. Let me try this again. Will be probably a little bit of a boring segment here for a second, but let me try putting this up on the web and then building a link to it. So this is my OC2 racket. So we have just an S3 console here. Let me go up to some. Let's try putting this in the scripts directory. Okay, so that file should now be publicly on the internet, and I should be able to, let me make the post from here. Let me try making a quick post to the Oculus developer board. Oh, I don't really want to phone type this long URL. Well, let's just pretend that works. But But the idea being that that's up there then, and then the link, if it's visible in like on a board on the forum, you could click on that, and then it would say insert it into the HMD, download anything necessary, and then start executing it. So that's not, we have a lot of discussions about security and sandboxing and implications about letting people download arbitrary script code, where it's not native code, but everything has bugs. I'm sure there's some way to break out of the basic performance sandbox from Racket. You certainly have to break their foreign function interface and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of work to be done before we could let that go out into the wild. But that's an interesting model when you start seeing that. That's what I would desperately like to see in a development community on the forums, people are saying, well, here's what I was trying to do. Here's my program. Here's the code with one link. And then here's the executable link with the other one. Tap on that, see what it does, and get that kind of really quick back and forth communications and iteration. So I might open it up to questions, answer any questions about what we've got here. If there's something that you'd like to see how it should be implemented in this, I'd be happy to talk about it. So we've got, I think, microphone. Where is it? Oh, right here. Sorry.
Hi. I really like the really fast iteration that you just you were able to do a lot. That, yeah, I think what really blew me away was mostly the fact that, yeah, you don't really have to set up a whole development environment, which is something that's like a whoa when you're switching computers every time that you're trying to just develop something. Aside from that, at least I'm pretty sure most of us here are pretty much in tune with the native side. I don't think, unless we've had any particular issues that, like switching computers or anything, at least in my opinion, I don't really think I would need to switch aside from that. So I'm guessing you have a particular target audience for people who are trying to just get into the space. I mean, I know the problem you're trying to solve is mostly rapid iteration, prototyping and stuff. So where do you draw the line between going from scripting to just native? I mean, who is your
Okay, so, well, first I would say I bet you've misestimated things. Would everybody raise their hand that's built a native SDK project? About a quarter.
Awesome.
So that's actually pretty good because that's a little more than I would expect, probably because it drew a more technical crowd here. But in general, not that many people are, like 95% of the applications are Unity-based. There's not a whole lot that are done native. Native does let you get the higher performance features. Like one of my goals for this was, everybody's seen my critiques of a lot of other applications, and I'm always pointing out things about the rendering and aliasing and so on. By default, this does everything right. It runs in gamma correct sRGB space. It has MSA on. The fonts are all sign distance field fonts. When you throw up a picture, it winds up feathering the outline, and it automatically transitions between the overlay planes to use that for much higher resolution. In fact, if we could go back to the phone for a second, to show. Show one of the other scripts as the example of that. Because I've been pushing for a long time to try to get people to use some of these features more significantly, but like in this, in the VR Tour application, this uses, when you say I want a panoramic background, it's just the one-line command, and we can turn the volume down on that again. So if you throw in one of the 1536 cube maps, it automatically uses that at the full kind of high peak resolution, which if the people that just kind of standardly do things in the game engines wind up at the much lower resolution. And then one of the things that I was very happy about doing on this is we've got little focus points here. So right now it's using the overlay plane, the time warp layer, for the background. But when you pop up an inlay picture, it then switches to using that for the peak resolution. So you can't tell here, but in the head-mounted display, that has over twice as many pixels as if you just kind of draw something in the standard way. So getting the best quality, which nobody's done these things yet. I wish people had more on just media viewing applications, but I wanted to make sure that these best practices happened pretty much by default. But then, yes, the hardcore programmer or serious native programmer that's building a big application, I would not expect to use this. There was a debate about, or a discussion of, should we port Cinema over to VRScript? No, of course not. That's a big application that has a lot of code in it already. There wouldn't be a real benefit for moving it over. This is mostly for developing kind of web scale experiences where there are so many things that on the web you would not pay 99 cents for, but the derived value is in the aggregate, where you can look at a huge number of things and they sum up to a lot. And I think that there's a lot of cases of content that somebody would not go and create it and bundle it into an app and submit it to the store, but that's going to be critical for the long-term success of virtual reality, where people taking snapshots with lots of crazy different cameras, how do you get that into Gear VR right now? If we had a ton of media applications and people had demonstrated all that and it just worked, we had our universal media player that did the peak quality work, then I wouldn't feel as much need to work on this. But if we had there is value to doing experiments with this. I use this now on a fairly regular basis. So just last week, I got access to some of these lunar panoramas that were in a cylindrical panorama projection format that, again, we don't support in 360 photos. I could have made a template project, started it up, and done that, and that would have taken maybe a half hour to get everything right. Instead, it was just Command-T, open up a new tab in Racket and write out the 5 lines of boilerplate, then start building that. And it was in that one file kind of application. And that's something that I do miss from the big projects. It feels ridiculous in many cases to create a solution or a workspace and then a project inside it and then pull over the template stuff to build simple things. This is in no way a replacement for highly sophisticated apps. If in the best case world we see, people would have said that about JavaScript a long time ago as well, and things grow beyond their original intentions sometimes. But I would say I have my clear, bright lines where if you are developing a skeletal animation system, or if you need a skeletal animation system, a particle system, or a physics system, you should clearly be using Unity or Unreal. You should be using a real game engine. If you have to do a lot of interaction with Java or other native code or something, then you should be writing a native application. But I think that there's going to be a large number of these simple things. Because the other driver for me on this, aside from the media, was social kernels. That was one of the things that we really found, where just putting the avatars and having the chat rooms, if there's nothing there, just the social chat room, you say, gee, this is neat, I'm talking to this person, but there's not a draw to stay there. But almost any little thing can provide that kernel. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for doing, I guess I can show one of the other sample applications that I did for this. So the idea of doing really trivial little things, but okay, you've got an environment, you've got some commands, and then you've got a game board that you can sit down. And I expect that we'll wind up having all the basics of board games and card games. But there's still clearly, even just right inside Oculus, we have things like games that are being developed with Unity. We have our native applications like video and 360 photos that are being developed natively. And then we have some social experiences that are being developed with this. So my core thesis for this was that there was a necessary middle layer, or a useful middle layer between them.
Awesome. That's perfect, actually. Thanks.
Hi, John.
Yep.
Thanks for the talk, and I think my favorite feature of VRScript right now is the speed of development. I saw you make changes, and instantly you just see it right there.
Yes, fumbling around up here, making mistakes. Clearly also not rehearsed.
That's okay. I guess my question is a couple things, actually. Is VRScript limited to Gear VR right now, or is there a PC version that you can maybe create VR apps on the PC? And is there a way for submission to the App Store that we can package them in a self-contained app without having to have an APK and then download scripts?
So the plan right now is Michael Antonov is working with me on both PC support and JavaScript. And these are all, no firm strategic decisions on any of this have been made, but the go-ahead that I have right now is to allow this to be used as an APK creation tool. Some of that code, the URIs that you saw me typing in can be done, they support regular HTTP connections. They also support file schemes, so you can do this without an internet connection at all if you don't mind ADB pushing the files onto your phone, which in many cases is more convenient than pushing them up to a web server. And then there's also the APK schema that I've got for that. So you can bundle all the things into the APK and then use it like that. So sometime, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, there will be some preliminary SDK kit that is basically, that lets you do this type of work. I'd be surprised if somebody put something together in the next few months that they wanted to submit to the store, but that option would at least be available. I think that we have to go through a more, kind of a learning curve time where it's pretty raw right now in the feature sets. And what I'm hoping for is we get to this forum situation where people are trying things, telling me what's obviously missing, because right now it's developed around my needs, the tasks that I'm working on, and I'm sure there's enormous blind spots in it.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I have two questions. One is it possible to extend it? For example, let's say if I have some native code that I want to wrap up in a Racket function and expose that.
So I don't have I haven't formed a good opinion on that yet. There's a lot of, that opens up a whole lot of issues there. I think that I'm going to be able to, I'll certainly do a chroot sandbox and probably hopefully carve off all the system calls. So it might be possible to do just number crunching type stuff without being much of a security problem. But I think I would lean towards saying if it's really performance intensive to just build a native application. It may evolve that way, but I think there's clear enough lines where I don't want to go down that too soon. It does put me obviously in the privileged position of I add a new message type for anything that I want to do myself, but we'll see.
The other question is, so you mentioned there's the TCP pipe where you communicate that stuff. Is it possible to swap out the front end for, say, another language?
Yes, completely. And that was Michael Antonov. The first thing that he did was basically write a JavaScript program using Node that emits S expressions for this. So the wire protocol is S expressions. It's got the Lisp heritage, and I do think that's actually one of the strongest points about Lisp with the S expressions and the readers and the writers. But you can emulate that in any language. You could write a C++ front end for it if you wanted to. It would just be a poor choice for that. But the JavaScript implementation talks to it. It just, the APK has no idea what it's talking to. It's just got a protocol. And I think that's one of those things where it's easy to rebel against that as a performance-focused engineer. It's like what we're putting everything out to text in between. But we have a lot of performance headroom in that type of processing. We're thousands of times faster than when we might consider something like that. A funny point, I did consider all the way back in Quake 1 using essentially text strings for all of my media identifiers, and that was 1,000 times less powerful computer. I wound up not doing that, but it was a near thing, and we ran like that for a while. So I don't feel too bad about doing all of that. It probably does cost us a millisecond or two doing all of the transport there, where if it was all native. And that was one of my reasons for wanting to use Chibi Scheme embedded is I had all this possibility. I could rewrite the garbage collector. I could make Vec3s and Mat4s native primitives that weren't even boxed. There was lots of things that, as the optimizer, the programming geek, I would be thinking this would be fun to go extend all of that. But then I just realized that's not a good use of my time, and just making it's a completely forked process now, which is really kind of lovely. It's an unmodified Racket Android system there, and whatever other languages we put there, they're just going to be forked processes with pipes set up for standard out, standard error, and then they connect locally over TCP. So I'm pretty happy with that. There's a performance cost to it, but it's extremely flexible.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Just a quick question here, maybe just a shot in the dark. Is there any plans to release some sort of lightweight IDE based around VRScript?
Well, one of my main reasons for liking Racket is that the Dr. Racket IDE works on PC, Mac, and Linux, and it's a single-click download. It's really great. It's not Visual Studio in terms of all the feature sets, but for making these relatively simple things, it's very close to what I would consider ideal for building these small things. So I thought that was one of the big wins.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So one of the neat things with this is that it's very real time. You know, you can add changes in and then see them pretty much instantly. But it seems like it's also lightweight enough that in theory you could do the coding in the headset as well, be able to type it all out. And I've seen people do that before. Is there any plans to maybe add in some kind of ability so that you can type your code with a keyboard while in the headset and then see the changes live?
So I say to myself clearly that this is a bad direction, but it will probably happen accidentally anyways. You know, we are going to get an error console that, so like all the standard out stuff, all your printfs go to something that you can pop up while you're in VR. And then it's just such a short step there to, it's like, okay, allow somebody to have the Bluetooth keyboard and type some things in and use it to evaluate expressions or communicate some way. So I don't believe there's value there, but I believe it will happen sooner or later just because there's this pull to do it. I mean, it's so commonly heard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. As a web developer, this kind of thing really appeals to me. I was wondering if you've interacted with the Moz VR guys or the Web VR guys.
So WebVR is, so it's worth contrasting the layers of abstraction here, where WebVR is a thin wrapper on top of like the Oculus SDK that lets you use WebGL to draw the eye views. Importantly, what I've got here is it's not a retained mode seed graph where it's retaining information state in the APK side of things, but it is surface-based where you specify models or surfaces and you're not drawing each eye. That's important for me because we want to be moving everything towards using the multi-view extension, which we're working with ARM and Qualcomm and Samsung to get adopted into these because it's going to be about a 30% CPU improvement for us on the phones where we specify everything one time and then it can replay it on the GPU for each eye. And it also allows us to do environment captures from, from a single scene description. So the WebVR is not something that I think has. Well, I got to admit, WebGL has succeeded far beyond what I expected it to. So I don't write off WebVR, especially on the PC, but it's a harder situation on mobile where everything has to be much more perfect. And a lot of the value that's coming from this is making everything use these optimal things like the time warp and the right rendering setup, where if WebVR starts running on Gear VR, it will be sort of the lowest possible common denominator for how your models and geometry and everything would show up there. There may yet be value. I'm not sure that crossing the gulf of performance between the PC, where you can throw ridiculous horsepower at it. It's not like your WebVR script on the PC is going to run on Gear VR, but if you built it the other way around, then it likely could. I wish them the best on all the Mozilla team working on that, but I think that the being more directly tied to our strengths in the SDK with something like this is a better bet for us.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim. Being so early in the process, it's kind of tempting to use Vulkan testing with VRScript. What are your thoughts on value added with such an engineering approach with VRScript, and then just letting Vulkan be as it is and see what happens?
So I have had surprisingly good results doing a lot of little OpenGL hacking with this, where I'm just like, let's set up a program, and even just the matter of iterating on shaders here, where it is, because the shaders are just text in there, I can change something, save it, and reload, as opposed to, I've probably done hundreds of cycles of that with my native code with a 30-second development cycle where I'm like, just change one thing and it still doesn't work. So it's been kind of surprisingly valuable for hacking around on some basic graphics things. And we are trying to make this more block state based. We're very much considering how we want to do this surface-based approach with what in Vulkan we're going to wind up having set up for it. One thing that I know I have ahead of me is right now there's no direct issuing of drawing calls in here because I want it to be this surface-based for the multi-view and everything. But I know for drawing into FBOs and generating textures that I'm going to have to eventually have some basic drawing interface. And I'm not sure exactly what I want to do for that. Making it easy to test, that's always been a problem for testing new hardware APIs and things like that, where if you've got a long iteration cycle, of course, with Vulkan, we're probably going to have to worry about crashing the phones in the early days as the drivers mature, and the development environment's not going to help us too much there. There might be some utility to making a whole set of bindings to be able to do that, but that's one of those tough value calls because there's going to be a large amount of setup to get all of the defines and functions and interfaces set up there. Do you save enough on iteration there? I think my gut feeling is it would probably be a net loss, but it might be a near thing.
Thanks.
Hey, John. So you mentioned, I think, 3 levels of abstraction, the engine itself, Racket, and then JavaScript. I was curious as to why why Racket is the middleman of sorts.
No, it's not. JavaScript would be replacing Racket entirely. So the APK has its ports open, and you can basically fork off the Racket interpreter or fork off whichever JavaScript interpreter we wind up going with. And in theory, we could have Python or whatever else you want there. Somebody would have to put up you'd have to write a library that knows how to speak the wire protocol that I've got, but we could potentially support a bunch of things. The VR script scheme would point to our APK, and then we could look at the file extension to decide what interpreter to use. I mean, it would be best if we don't have a broadly scattered language infrastructure. We'll see how the general opinion is that if JavaScript is available, everyone will use that. But I think that some people might be surprised at how kind of nice and convenient and sort of fun working with Racket in the IDE and everything across it is.
Which is a shout out to John Clements, because he helped develop in Racket.
Good deal. All right, and we're only 1.5 minutes over time budget, so that was, okay, great.
Hi, John. I'll make this quick. I was wondering if there are any sort of security or performance concerns that you had in mind about downloading VR script things over the internet. So when I was watching it, the first thing I thought was this would be really cool if this was kind of like a Gear VR web browser and you could download the different Racket files from different places. Are there any concerns about?
There are enormous concerns about all of that, where, of course, in theory, you have an interpreted language, you can sandbox it, but of course, in practice, that has never really worked out with the bulletproof nature that we'd like to have. We have some meetings scheduled to bring in. We've got a lot of experience at Facebook with this type of thing, and it is outside my realm of experience. Left to myself, I would sort of say, hey, it kind of works, let's go see what happens, and that would probably have been kind of bad. But we have experts, we have domain experts on a lot of that at Facebook, and we're starting to bring them into the conversation now. So everybody's comfortable with releasing this as like an APK creator, where it would go through the same approval process as any of our existing apps. But I want to get to that more open space, but it's just going to take longer to make sure that we're not messing up we're not a vector for bad things to happen to our users.
And when do I get to play with this?
So depending on I've got this list of things that I get to figure out what I want to do when I get back home tonight. VR script is one of my major initiatives. And it could be as soon as a week from now if I build the APK packaging tools and put something out. It would be pre-alpha, very rough. We have a tiny bit of setup documentation that's been written for it. Personally, I lean towards getting things out in a rougher shape. I admire the Facebook move fast and break things mantra about it. I would like to iterate to success rather than trying to build the perfect release. But it depends on other things, like if Mojang lets me back into the code base, I'm going to be working on Minecraft as my top priority for things. And there's a few other possibilities. But I hope within a small number of weeks at most that something will be out there to play around with. Because I think even at the level that it's at, there are a number of media applications that I would like to see people write. Just if it gets to the web page sort of things with links, my vision for this would be every content creator, every panoramic photographer that has a web page or a web presence also has the little link that goes to their VR gallery that lets you view things. And I think that lightweight stuff has a lot of value, and I think that this can be a really good enabler for it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, John. I'm Reed. This is the last question. So I just wanted to say this is going to be easy thing. So for the last 20 years of my life, you've been such an inspiration to me. I've had some times of darkness, and it's been amazing. Today's my birthday. I would
Happy
just love,
birthday.
I would love to like go up there and if someone could take a picture of me with you, that's all I ask. I don't, like, that,
Come on up. All right. 4.5 minutes over budget. Good timing. All right.
someone take a picture of us? Oh man.
Did you get it?
Can I have a hug?
All right.